Welcome back to Block TV. It's time for Bird Talk, in which we talk to crypto Twitter with Pierre Rochard, one of Bitcoin's fiercest advocates, who has been writing and advising about cryptosphere since 2013. Well, every week Pierre shares his insights on his favorite and least favorite tweets of the week and breaks down his reasons for his choices. Thanks, Pierre, for joining us. So let's always start off with the good news, your favorite tweet from HODLNOT.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. Favorite tweet from HODLNOT is about UASF, the user-activated Softfork. This dates back a couple of years, and so we have the 2-year anniversary of it on August 1st, I think it was. And the essentials of it is that there was a very long and protracted scaling debate within Bitcoin about, do we scale on-chain or do we find more creative solutions for scaling off-chain? And the user-activated Softfork is, you could actually use this method of upgrading the Bitcoin protocol for any kind of change. In this case, it was for what's called SegWit, or segregated witness, which was kind of a technical change that enabled two different things. First of all, it allowed for a on-chain capacity increase. So before SegWit, we could only get blocks that were up to 1 megabyte. And after SegWit, we actually changed it to where it's blocks up to what's called 4 million weight units, which roughly translates into about 2 megabytes. And so we have seen blocks that are bigger than 1 megabyte since we've activated SegWit. And this just allows for more on-chain scaling. Now, the second part was fixing what's called transaction malleability. And what this allowed is people used to be able to modify a transaction's identifier after they had created it. And this actually is a problem for layer 2 scaling solutions like Lightning. So it had to be fixed. To enable Lightning on Bitcoin's mainnet. And SegWit originally was going to go through as a miner activated Softfork, so that miners would signal that they are ready for SegWit. And this actually led to some confusion in the community about the role of miners in the system, because the miner signaling is supposed to just be a proxy measure, one form of indicating how the overall ecosystem is prepared for a Softfork. And instead it was taken as being a vote. And in democracies, when you vote and you get over 50%, the result is binding on the entire population on the rest of the 50%, even if they disagree. And that's just not how Bitcoin works. Bitcoin is not a democracy, it's a peer-to-peer network. And there are similarities, for sure, in that people can express themselves, and there's still an element of liberalism in the political, philosophical sense of the term. But it has a completely different governance model than a democracy where you have an up or down vote. And what the user-activated Softfork was that essentially we ran out of patience with the miners. The miners were no longer representing what the overall community, the direction they wanted to go with Bitcoin, and they were dragging their feet on SegWit. And so there was a contingent within Bitcoin that said, okay, let's do a user-activated Softfork where we will unilaterally, as people running Bitcoin full nodes, we will fork the chain, and we won't accept blocks that are not SegWit activated. And so in August, that was kind of the flag day, when it was, after this point, we're no longer going to accept non-SegWit blocks. Now, there's a lot of debate about what effect this had on the game theory with the miners, because ultimately the miners did indeed capitulate and go forward with SegWit. So one side believes that UASF pushed them to do that, and another side believes that a compromise, which we don't necessarily have to get on with here, is SegWit 2x was what drove the miners to do that. In any case, I think that it's an important reminder of Bitcoin's decentralized governance structure. And another really important aspect of UASF, and in this case, UASF applied to SegWit was formalized in a BIP, a Bitcoin improvement proposal called BIP 148. And it was proposed by someone who really was not a regular Bitcoin contributor. He was not part of the set of Bitcoin Core open source developers. He's a bit of an outsider, Shaolin Fry, and he proposed this change. It was proposed to be put into the Bitcoin Core repository, but it was actually rejected because the Bitcoin Core contributors did not see BIP 148 as the way to move forward in terms of building consensus behind SegWit. So Shaolin Fry and people who agreed with him released their own version of Bitcoin that then others downloaded and ran as their full node. So I think that this shows that while there's a perception that the Bitcoin Core GitHub repository is some kind of middleman or gatekeeper in this governance process, it's actually trivial to circumvent their gatekeeping because Bitcoin is open source and it's permissionless. And all you have to do as someone who's trying to upgrade Bitcoin is to get people to run your node software. You don't have to persuade the developers to merge your change in. So I think on a number of different levels, UASF is really important, and it's just a part of Bitcoin's history that I think people who want to learn more about Bitcoin should familiarize themselves with.
Mm-hmm. And I know, a lot of Bitcoin supporters, view it as a kind of an Independence Day, kind of this freedom, this win against big business and the miners. In the post SegWit world, the post BIP 148 world, how is that relationship today between the miners and the Bitcoin community, as well as is there any sort of issues coming that you see forthcoming that could be the next big challenge to the power?
Yeah, so I think that miners have, really it's not so much the miners, it's other participants in the ecosystem who had expectations of the miners that were unrealistic. The miners, they just have all of this hardware and they're consuming electricity and they're pointing their hash rate at whatever chain is the most profitable for them to point it at. For the most part, that's BTC Bitcoin, but it's not like they are, they don't have special insight into what would make Bitcoin valuable or what would be an improvement to Bitcoin. They have an important role in the system, but they're not the caretakers or the maintainers of Bitcoin. And I think that not only did UASF and the No2X movement help them realize this, it also helped other participants in the ecosystem realize this. So going forward, I think it's still an open question as to how do we have a way of signaling that the overall ecosystem is ready for an upgrade to the Bitcoin protocol? Because it's actually what's called a Schelling point. And in game theory, a Schelling point is one great example is if you are meeting a complete stranger in New York City and you have no way of communicating with them or coordinating, where and at what time do you meet with them? And so what they've found through surveys is that most people would meet at Grand Central Station at noon. And there's a bunch of underlying reasons for why that's the case. But the central part of it is that you don't have the ability to communicate or coordinate with the other person. And we have the same problem in Bitcoin because any form of communication or coordination is prone to what's called a Sybil attack, where people can fake communication, they can fake their support for a specific Bitcoin upgrade or fake their opposition to it and create an army of Twitter bots or Reddit bots or whatever it is, and astroturf it. So we really have to think more deeply about how we're going to do Bitcoin protocol upgrades. Now, I think that what we currently have in the pipeline for soft forks is deeply uncontroversial. And so if we look at the Schnorr and Taproot soft fork, I haven't heard of anyone put forward plausible arguments against it. And so I think that it has the overwhelming support of all of the ecosystem players. And when it gets activated is going to be perhaps the most controversial part of just picking a date and committing to that. So we'll see how that shakes out. Maybe I'll submit a BIP and try to crystallize some support behind it. But I think that ultimately we have to recognize that the miner activation, I don't think is the way to go. I think that doing another user-activated soft fork is in line with our current understanding of the Bitcoin protocol, and we should just move forward with a second UASF.
Well, Pierre, you definitely have my support. I know how tough it could be to knock down, a date. Even with 5 of my friends wanting to get dinner, that's tough. I imagine getting the whole Bitcoin community together and to knock on a date is even tougher. Well, let's move on to your least favorite tweet, and that comes from the Wall Street Journal, I believe.
Yes, so Capital One accidentally had a lot of data hacked, 106 million card customers and applicants, one of the biggest breaches at a bank. And I think that this really highlights an important principle that is put forth by Nick Szabo of trusted third parties are security holes. And so anytime that we give our data to a trusted third party, now they see it as an asset. And we actually see companies just trying to accumulate as much data as possible because for them, they think that they're going to be able to mine this data for actionable insights and for marketing purposes to make more money later. And so that has skewed the incentives. And then for the consumers, we don't feel like we have a choice, but also we end up trusting these companies, and we think that, well, if they lose our data, it's not a big deal. So I think that we've got to completely reform how this is being handled, because then in Europe they are passing data-related legislation, which is so heavy-handed and doesn't really make sense. I don't think the solution is legislative. I think the solution is cryptographic. And we have the cryptographic technology today to be able to share data without having our privacy so easily compromised. So, for example, a credit card number today is basically the equivalent of a private key. And we give this private key to so many merchants online when really we could give them a public key like we do in Bitcoin. And that way, if it got breached, then we can just void the public key and still keep the same private key and still keep the same credit card. So I think that the whole financial infrastructure that has gotten built up is very much lacking in the capabilities of public-private key cryptography, and we need to reimagine it. I actually think the only way for such a profound reform of the financial system to happen is with Bitcoin, is by having an entirely new payments and monetary system that allows us to start with a clean slate, and then we can rethink the credit system and really change the way it works at a deep level.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I always get shocked when I see these stories because, like you just said, we trust them with our data. Now, when it comes to Capital One and these other banks, we trust them because they're banks. So in our minds, they're good at holding money, at protecting money. They're tough to crack. Now, the fact of the matter is that today's day, in modern economy, the majority of value and money that are sitting in these banks are not physical bills, but rather online and digital money, in this case cash, but still digital money, and that seems to never have a problem. They never really, any of these banks never seem to get hacked for the money, they always get hacked for the data. Now, how come they're capable, seemingly perfectly capable, of maintaining proper security for their monetary assets, their digital monetary assets, but not for the customer's data? They're holding both. They're holding the customer's money, they're holding the customer's data, yet one seems to slip through a lot more than the other.
I think that we don't hear about some of these monetary breaches. And part of it is legislative. So there is legislation in place that says that a corporation has to notify people if their data gets breached. But if it's the bank's money that is digitally being hacked, then there isn't legislation about that. They can paper that over and they can hide it. And we've actually seen a lot of wire fraud, of credit card fraud, of all sorts of different fraud where people are essentially, getting into these digital accounts and getting people's digital dollars. The worst case scenario involved, at a very high level, the Federal Reserve and foreign government officials, where billions of dollars were siphoned out. So I think that part of it is that they just don't make that public. And then the other part of it is that I think they're a lot more lax about our data because to them, it doesn't really matter as much as trying to secure the money itself, which I can understand from their perspective, because adding security is always a tremendous cost and reduces their convenience. But I think that ultimately the solution is trying to find ways where if I'm applying for a credit card, they shouldn't necessarily know my home address. I should be able to provide cryptographic proof of my home address that puts it in a neighborhood maybe, or in a geographic region, without giving them the exact address itself.
So you're saying that the key is necessarily maybe not sharing all the data that we had been until now, and possibly them leaning on the advances that people like you and others in the cryptocurrency field have done to boost security. There's a lot of lessons to be learned on both sides of the table. Hopefully big businesses and big banks, whether maybe to get them to adopt Bitcoin might be a little bit too much, but hopefully they learn the lessons that have been learned from the crypto sphere. Pierre Rochard, thank you so much for joining us, sharing us your least favorite and favorite tweets. As always, we love to see you here, and for all of us at Block TV, it's always a pleasure. I'm Yonah Hochhauser. Thanks for stopping by.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.